Sex Nation, Jeanne Allert, take one.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay, step right.
Okay, we're gonna blast through some stats real quick.
Mhm.
So my first question, if you can't answer this, if you can speak to a percentage or a ratio of just people in America that were sexually abused as children.
What we know about victims of domestic sex trafficking is that 94 to 97% of those individuals were molested as children. At what age? We have seen everything from infants, most often in the work that we've done around age 8, at the hands of a family member. And so we are talking about individuals who've led a lifetime of abuse before they've been exploited.
Perfect, thank you.
Just a minute.
Sure. Oh yeah, thanks,
And wispy.
You better.
Dan.
Great.
He thinks of
My
everything.
cow.
He thinks of everything.
Next question is the number of trafficking victims in the U.S.
There's really no way of knowing how many people in the United States are being exploited, have been exploited. We have a lot of numbers that we can estimate based on arrests, and we can look at that data, but that would only be those individuals who've had an intersection with law enforcement. My area of expertise is familial trafficking, and that means that that's happening within the context of the family, and so that's shrouded in secret. And those are episodes of exploitation that we may never know about.
And on that, if you could just speak to the rate of victims of trafficking that it's familial cases. The familial rate of trafficking within trafficking. Help me with this question, you know what I'm trying to ask.
The percentage
The
of that's,
percentage
yeah,
that
gotcha.
is familial, yeah.
Sure. We just completed a study in 2021 that looked at the prevalence of familial sex trafficking, essentially a child being sexually exploited by a family member. And what we found by looking across the United States through the lens of justice professionals is that trafficking that is familial is anywhere from 26 to 47% of all child trafficking cases. So anywhere from a quarter to a half of the child sex trafficking cases may well be at the hands of a caregiver.
That's good, thank you, Jean. Okay, safe home openings, open beds. How many openings are there in the U.S. at any given time? And if you could frame that against what you just said, which was maybe a rough shot in the dark at how many victims are out there who need those beds.
I'd say let's frame this a little differently. Any way you want to answer it, Jean, in a conversational setting of just the status of shelter care and just where are the voids, the certain pockets in the country, and you can even make this an extended answer of
Okay.
the nature of shelter care.
Sure.
You know, and if you want to move into how they interact and how girls are not always from your town, and sometimes it's finding placement and some of the challenges in that, and let's just have a conversation holistically.
Okay.
We're going to find the nuggets, you'll see.
And I'll put some breaks in so you can chop it up if you need to.
Of just shelter care, of just
Sure.
where, yeah, okay.
So let's take a look at what the victim services response is to survivors of exploitation here in America. We know that maybe 40% of survivors of exploitation might ever get direct services, meaning short-term or long-term care. I've been doing this work since 2007, and back in those days when we started, there might have been 24 agencies across America that were endeavoring to specialize in this form of victimization. Right now, in 2022, we have 231 shelter agencies that are focused on victims of exploitation here in the United States. That includes those agencies that serve adults and minors. That includes those who serve male, female, or both genders. That includes those who might specialize in addiction or various levels of acuity in mental health. And so it's really not very many agencies at all. In fact, right now we have 8 states that have no shelter program whatsoever and 9 states that have only one. So we have a long way to go to fill in the gaps. When we started this work, we recognized that we were very much in response to the problem as we understood it. And back in 2007 to 2014, we recognized this problem, or frankly saw this problem, as largely being something up and against females. And so that's where most of the service provision came into play. And so right now, 90% of the agencies that are in existence serve specifically female victims. We have about 34 agencies in the United States now that serve men and boys. We have some growing areas of concern like pregnant and women with children. Still, the number two areas, number one and number two, being a woman with a child and a woman who is pregnant, are the most common to be turned away for services because the shelter agencies are not equipped or the legal obligations are too high for them to enter into that kind of work. What we need to be doing as we move forward is continue to be aware of how the landscape of victimization is changing and how the shelter services have to be in accord with that. For example, very few of our shelter agencies across America have multilingual services. And as we look at what's happening on the southern border with immigration, with a lot of migration across the United States, agencies are going to have to step up and fill in those gaps. We also see that we've become more aware of the mental health needs of survivors, that for some this is chronic and very acute, and so we're going to need agencies who specialize. We also are beginning to get better data about specific populations, like those that are not ambulatory, those who might need assistive services, those who want care with a support animal. And so this means that the landscape is going to have to become much more specialized as we proceed with this work.
Jeanne, on that topic, the result of the border situation as it impacts, and I don't want to lead you in your answer, but as it impacts shelter care, are you saying you're seeing some of those migrants end up in shelter care, which does that mean that they fall prey to traffickers?
Where we are right now, we can't quantify what the impact is of millions of people coming into this country from nations across the globe. We can't direct our energies and say, oh my gosh, we need to have one language competency, because in fact we're seeing many different nationalities. We are not equipped for the cultural sensitivities that we need to have within these different programs. And so we don't know fully what the impact is going to be, but we are braced for needing to change and needing to stay dynamic and fluid and in response to the victim population. What we do know is this: we have a significant population of people who are keenly vulnerable, and they fit all of the check boxes of exploited persons. Often than not, they are homeless. Often than not, they are struggling with economic insecurity. Often than not, they are separated from family and the infrastructures of community. Those are classic conditions that make somebody ripe for exploitation. And so we think that it is more than a probable guess that we are going to see a significant demand on shelter services to meet this special population.
Solid, thank you.
I want that just as a note to go into the border section. So
I have that.
we just entered Jeanne into the border section. So, okay, beautiful. Keep going. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful, Jeanne. Back to stats. Thank
Sure.
you. If you could speak to, you mentioned that there are several safe homes now that are opening to treat men and boys. So could you give me a picture of how, like, what the percentage is of male victims and survivors versus female victims and survivors?
I'll give you my best guess.
Sure, your best guess.
Yeah. What we understand about victimization in the United States through arrest records, through encounters with drop-in centers, with outreaches, and with residential programs is that still, by and large, the victim population is female. So we see still around 97% of the time, we are talking about a female population. The male population is very difficult for us to quantify, but the statistics as we know them right now are still pretty hardy. That is, somewhere between 1 and 3% of the victim population is male.
That's perfect, thank you.
these shelters, is there a different dynamic in dealing with a male survivor versus a female survivor? Similarities or differences, just in your opinion? Does it post a particular set of different demands by gender?
I think we have to lean into what we know about human development. We have decades of studying child development, human development. There's a lot of body of research that tell us that boys and girls are different. And so for us to approach survivors and say, well, their experience is going to be identical, would be in violation of everything we understand about human beings. We know that boys are going to carry more shame, that they are going to tend to be more silent. We know this from the sexual abuse literature, from boys that have suffered from physical and emotional, spiritual and sexual violence as children, that they tend to hold it longer, they tend to have less of a community of support, they may feel more isolated, they may act out in ways that are aggressive, as opposed to a woman or a young girl whose aggression may be pointed inward, as opposed to a male whose aggression may be pointed outward. And so that's where service providers who are going to serve men and boys have to be very attuned to the fact that their needs are going to be different.
Okay, let's move on. Yeah, it's great.
Within trafficking victims and survivors, what is the average age, and is a certain ethnicity more targeted than others?
It's very difficult to speak about trafficking in general because we can't put our hands on all of the data with absolute certainty and say we know what size the victim population is and we can build profiles around them. What we can build profiles around is who intersects with service providers, because then we have an encounter and we have an opportunity to understand more about the definition, the demographics and psychographics of individuals who seek out care or who are presented for care. And what we know about that subpopulation of the exploited, those who have an encounter with service provision, is again largely female. We see that the younger individuals who are being exploited generally do not present on their own volition to service providers. If somebody is going to present for services, they're generally older. So we would say 26 and up would be somebody who would submit themselves into a care program, for example. We have to understand, though, that that's so in concert with the nature of the trade. Because if you have an individual who is 15, 17 years old, 20 years old, that is, well, frankly, that's money. And that is going to be money that is realized in more private circles, in more secrecy. We're not going to generally see the 12-year-old child is not going to bubble up to the service provision level. But what we do see is we see the individuals who have gone through those experiences of having been a child that was passed around at age 12, who then finally ran away from home at 15 because it was intolerable, who ran out into the cold, hard world and there was only one way to survive, and somebody was more than happy to show them how they could survive. And then now, years later, enough is enough. They're sick of being sick and tired of being tired, and maybe there's one more chance that they could have a different life. And that's when we see them.
And again, understanding that this is within the framework of those who present for care. But do you see a typical household income bracket? That demographic, is it, only people from impoverished communities that end up in this work, or is it across the board?
While it is statistically true that people who are impoverished are more vulnerable to exploitation, it would be incorrect to say that poverty is an absolute condition for exploitation. In the 12 years that we were serving survivors, we had individuals who came from very affluent households. Because quite frankly, anybody can be rendered vulnerable in a different way. Maybe she's living in a very affluent household, but she's completely ignored by her parents. Maybe she doesn't want for anything. And so she grows up learning that it's all about what you can have. And so she gets to a point where she wants to have it for herself. Maybe she's looking for some excitement, and she just happens to run into the wrong group of people who are exciting, but they're also dangerous. And so we cannot draw an absolute line and say, well, it's only because of poverty, because sometimes it's relationship as well. It's parenting, it's your environment, it's your home.
That's good. I think that's a really good misconception to correct. Thank you. Okay. If I can ask you some questions about what you see in the pornography landscape, you may or may not be able to answer these. Within actors in porn, how many of them are really just being trafficked and exploited and not doing this of their own volition?
I don't know the answer to that, but I have a different...
Let's reframe it for Jeanne. Just a different lens. Do traffickers utilize the pornography industry for some of their victims as a source of income? And don't need a number, but just...
I have two. I have two that I can give you.
Okay.
We have long been looking at the intersection of pornography and sex trafficking. And as a service provider, I get to see that lens through the experiences of the women and girls who have come into our program. After 12 years of doing direct care, I can tell you that over 50% of the women that we served and the girls that we served knew that they had been used for the manufacture of child sexual abuse materials, of pornographic materials. But let's not stop at 50%, because what's important for you to understand is those are the ones that knew. There were so many conversations of individuals saying, I don't know because I wasn't conscious, or I was intoxicated, or I was told to close my eyes. And so I don't know whether or not my worst moments have now been captured and sold. In studying familial trafficking, one of the things that we learned out of the recent study in 2021 was that if a child was being sold by their biological mother over 60% of the time, that the child was usually not used for the creation of sexual abuse material. But if the perpetrator dynamic was mom plus paramour, mom plus boyfriend, then 78% of the time the child was also being used for the manufacture of pornographic material. So we know that it has high prevalence and high intersection with sexual exploitation.
Thank you, Jeanne. If you could give me just that sentence again, but say it as, we know that pornography has a high intersection rate with trafficking exploitation.
So we know that pornography has a high intersection with sexual exploitation.
Thank you.
That information right there is so valuable. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what we have next. Let's have a legislation discussion from your perspective. The laws that currently exist to A, deter perpetrators, and B, to protect potential victims, especially children. Are they sufficient? What strides need to be made?
That's so broad.
Yeah.
Can you narrow that down a little bit?
That's totally
Let's narrow it down this way. Any particular law that you felt made a positive impact when implemented? And is there any concern that we have laws on the books that by the law can do a lot of good, but it's not enforced? So basically draw the gap between, do we need more laws, or do we have the right laws, and then are they enforced? Because a law that's not enforced is not going to produce an outcome for us.
I'm going to give you just little bits and you decide if any of this
Yes,
will be of
yes.
use to you, because it'll be a little scattered.
Please.
I want to tell you about a piece of legislation that was survivor-led and gives us a great example of when we engage survivors in that part of the process. Instead of just making survivors being people who have to speak at conferences, what a wealth of information they actually have for us about the systems that they have also lived in. We had a survivor who understood that having come from out of state to our program, that she was going to have to pay out of state tuition in order for her to go to college. And that was 3 times the cost for her to attend community college. So that became a barrier for her. But then in scouring through the legislation within our particular state, she recognized that there was a law that said that if you were an abuse victim, your address could be masked. And she came to me with the question, well, if my address can be masked, then why does it matter where I live, the cost of going to college? What a brilliant question. And because of that brilliant question, she authored a bill that we then had her present to the Senate and to the House in our state that said, could human trafficking survivors who are getting care within our state be considered for in-state tuition regardless of where they live? Well, she got unanimous consent across the House and the Senate. And that was an example of putting legislation in place that is responsive to survivor needs, that is entirely survivor-informed and survivor-led. I think that, at least on the victim services side, that's where we could be much more engaged with survivor voices.
Fantastic.
Well, she was a really good criminal, so she knew a lot about the law. It's all about using your gifts.
No, fantastic. All right, let's keep going. That's amazing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Jeanne, open-ended question. What are your thoughts on the movement to decriminalize prostitution?
You know, you just can't sit with over 100 women and girls for sometimes 2 years of their life of recovery and listen to their stories and be invited into their pain and imagine that that is good, healthy, edifying, or dignifying to a woman. You can't hold those 2 conditions simultaneously because the cognitive dissonance is too much. I can't understand why somebody would say that the best thing that we have to offer a girl in America is to reduce her to her body. What we should be doing is saying the best thing that we could offer to a young girl or a young boy in America is hope and possibilities and a pathway to realizing those.
I want to continue on that. What would happen if prostitution unilaterally was decriminalized? The buy, the sell, the trade.
Sure.
What impact would that have? And if you can incorporate decriminalization in your answer.
We're very much following the movement to decriminalize prostitution in the United States, and there have been some states that have endeavored to put that forward. And by God's grace, that's not moving forward right now. But that doesn't mean that those forces will not continue. And so we continue to monitor that. And here's what we see as the prophetic significance should that go forward. If we were to decriminalize prostitution in the United States, then overnight we would have to abandon all of the language, all the philosophy that we have embraced about being victim-centered. That goes away because that individual is no longer a victim. That individual now has made a choice, whether we like it or not. And so we strip away the very empowering structures that we have endeavored to build over the last 20 years of the anti-trafficking movement to say survivors should have rights, victims should have certain remedies. We take all of that away and say, you know what? Bad choice, you're on your own. I don't see that ending well.
No, that was amazing.
That was an incredible answer.
No, that was amazing.
Golden.
Yeah, amazing.
He's just impressed that I haven't cussed one time yet.
No, one time. Let's go.
Your
I'm getting
answers
some
are-
amazing B-roll.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we're reshooting this interview.
Yes,
Thank you,
it's
Jeanne.
such a even since the last time this was shot, so much has changed, right? So it's thank you for
Isn't that the truth?
this wealth of information, Jeanne. Okay, I have 3 questions left on my list. If you could speak to the ways that traffickers you answered this question brilliantly last time. Traffickers identify vulnerabilities whether they know it or not according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and when they find their entry, they work their way down.
The deconstruction.
Yes.
That was so brilliant. If you could have that conversation again.
Okay.
Maslow, no matter where they enter, just get in and deconstruct.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
And I'm going to, in this section with you, bring a chart. I'm going to bring
I think I
Maslow.
sent the graphic over to you,
Yes.
Dan, but I can send it again if you don't have it.
Yeah, no, it's coming on screen.
Okay.
when you do this, yeah.
Terrific. After years of working with survivors, we wanted to understand, how does one get inducted into this commercial enterprise? What are the pathways that lead somebody to their level of vulnerabilities resulting in this kind of outcome? And it is so simplistic for us to just look at a few conditions and say, well, that's the formula that traffickers use. Frankly, we're not giving traffickers enough credit. Some of them are masterful manipulators and very good at human psychology. So we looked at human psychology and said, what can we learn from that and what can we understand? And you're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the classic triangle that we all learned in Psych 101. In exploring that, I want you to take an example from Maslow on how individuals can be rendered vulnerable at different levels. He used the triangle to explain needs, but needs are vulnerabilities, so let's just swap the language. Yes, absolutely, you can go to that bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy, which is the basic needs level. I'm hungry, I don't have housing, I need clothing, I need those basic needs, and you can enter in there by satisfying those needs. You know, you have a child who has run away from home and they haven't eaten in 3 days. It's pretty easy to approach that child on the level of basic needs. But traffickers can also move up that hierarchy. The next need is safety. That individual who's run away from a home where they are being chronically molested and abused and neglected, it's not safe at home. So I'm going to solve this problem by running away. Unfortunately, I just ran into something equally bad. But my motivation, my need, my vulnerability was at the safety level. But when we look at traffickers that we sometimes refer to as finesse pimps or boyfriend pimps, they're coming in at that next level of love and belonging. So here's this girl that maybe isn't popular, maybe isn't attractive, maybe doesn't have the social group, maybe the boy that's spending way too much time online or on video games. And that individual comes in, that predatory force comes in at the level of love and belonging. So we have to understand that the trafficker is just really good at identifying, where do I have to enter in? But where I enter in also depends on how much work that exploiter has to do. Because as I mentioned, if you come in at that basic needs level, just feeding the child is sufficient. But if I come in at a higher level of need like love and belonging, I have to then systematically deconstruct. So I have to take that individual from love and belonging to now fearing that that might leave, that I might abandon you, which is a safety issue. Or maybe I have to have intermittent feeding you or clothing you or giving you housing. And so now that individual is now deconstructed to the level of basic needs. It's really quite magnificent in a maleficent way. That the trafficker can use what we understand about human psychology and use it against us for the recruitment and retention of exploited persons.
So wonderful.
There's one more thing I want to say about that just because it's brilliant and because the survivor gave that to me, but you may use it or not.
Yeah.
I want to tell you something else about Maslow's triangle that I think that you will find insightful because I was taught it by a survivor. She came to me one time after starting in college and she said, Miss Jeanne, you know that triangle? You know that triangle? And I was like, I knew she was in psychology, so I said, yeah, I know what you're talking about. We all know the triangle. And she goes, well, I'm sure Maslow was a very nice man, but he's wrong. And I was fascinated. And she said, you know how he puts basic needs at the bottom, and then he has safety, and then he has love and belonging? Well, that's wrong. Safety goes at the bottom. Safety comes first. Because you know what, Miss Jeanne? You're not thinking about a sandwich when somebody's raping you. I think she's right. I think for the traumatized person, Maslow needs to flip.
Cool.
Wow.
That's cool. That's cool.
Wow. Thank you. When you began your work, this is another comment that you made in the previous session. When you began your work in 2007, there wasn't really an awareness of trafficking. There was an awareness of prostitution.
Mm-hmm.
And we've made great strides since then. You are one of the few people that we can talk to about decades now of work.
Way
Could you
back.
speak to that and what we've seen from then to now in 2022, and within that, like the definition of trafficking versus the definition of prostitution.
Just run your left hand through your hair on the left.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so you want this to just be a quick sort of retrospective of what we've
Yes.
seen in the sort of change in the landscape?
Right.
Okay. When God called me into this work in 2007, I knew nothing about the world of prostitution. I just knew that I'd had some encounters with women on the streets of Baltimore that ripped my heart and called me into this work. For anybody else who came on board with the anti-trafficking movement during that time, many of us had to learn from survivors themselves. And so what we learned was that prostitution really wasn't the right word for what we were seeing, because we were learning about the histories of individuals who had been abused since they were a young child, who's been passed around in their family or outside of their family, who had run away and encountered so many people who just abused them one after another, and it became their life. But we've learned over time that prostitution is certainly a crime. It is certainly a willful act of an individual who says, if I'm going to sell my body and I expect to reap whatever benefit or consequence comes from that, that's prostitution. But when we look at the means of force, fraud, and coercion, the definition of trafficking, we came to understand that there wasn't a single narrative that we heard from these prostitutes that didn't involve force, fraud, or coercion. Now, fast forward 15 years later within the field, what we're beginning to understand is that force really isn't the predominant mean. It's coercion, because coercion is very powerful. You have to understand what the vulnerability is of the person, and then you just have to threaten that vulnerability. And every one of us should be able to relate to that. We might say, gee, I can't imagine somebody would sell their own body. I can't imagine somebody would do that. But you can imagine feeling threatened. We're now looking at coercion with much greater nuance. As we go forward in the anti-trafficking movement, we're now seeing court cases that are having to show that if this child is saying, my mother sold me and my mother sold me for drugs, she never put a hand on me. She never physically hurt me. She just said my name, and I knew what that meant, what I was supposed to do. And that's a level of coercion we haven't even yet to begin to understand, but we need to if we're going to serve survivors well.
That's so wonderful. On that thought, I would love to get just a definitive statement from you defining the difference between needing force, fraud, and coercion to prove trafficking as an adult versus when it's a minor, don't even need that.
Gotcha. In the federal definition of trafficking, we have to have a compelled act with a economic gain, some form of tender that is exchanged, not necessarily money, could be drugs, could be services, by the means of force, fraud, and coercion if the victim is an adult. That means the law has to determine whether or not there were violence, lies, or threats used to compel that individual to do something that he or she would not otherwise do. But the law dictates that if the individual is under the age of 18, a child, then we do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, my last question is back to safe houses, the challenges of operating safe houses. Would you speak to the realm of regulations and licensing? What challenges you see there?
Is there a particular way you want it to go? Do you want to make a particular point?
Let me ask your opinion. Is it too much red tape, too stringent? Should it be more stringent? Just speak into that landscape of, I want to run a safe house.
Gotcha.
You know, and we see so often, and I'm like, no, you don't. You know, or you don't know what you're getting into. But from a regulatory standpoint, what is that landscape like?
Okay,
We haven't had anybody speaking to that.
I'll give it oral. Because I have too much to say, so I try to be concise on it. Okay. For residential treatment facilities or trafficking shelters, we have to understand that there is really a bifurcation based on the age of the survivor. If we have a survivor who is over the age of 18, considered a legal adult, then trafficking shelters largely are unregulated. Now, that can be a very positive thing because it can leave us wide open for creativity, innovation, responsiveness to the needs of the survivor. But it can also create kind of the wild, wild west out there, such that some people might think, well, I have a spare couch in my house, so I can open it up to trafficking survivors. That doesn't end well. Let me say that again. I don't like where that went.
You're good.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to running a trafficking shelter here in the United States, we have to understand that there is a bifurcation of how those shelters are handled based on the age of the victim. If the victim is over the age of 18, a legal adult, the trafficking shelters in the United States are largely unregulated. That means there's not, you can't go to school to learn how to run one. You can't necessarily get certified in running specifically a trafficking shelter. Now, I will say that landscape is changing, but right now, that's an unregulated space. And that can be a very good thing because we can learn from survivors, because we can be more innovative, because some shelter programs might have one intervention and another shelter program might be doing something else. So it's a rich opportunity for us to be creative and responsive to this very diverse population. But it can also be the wild, wild west. And it is dangerous for an individual to say, well, I have a heart for this, I have some space, I'm just going to open my home to a very dysregulated, traumatized, and high-need population. Now, the good news is that landscape is changing as organizations like ours are beginning to build standards within this and hope that agencies will voluntarily comply with those standards so that we can raise the caliber of care across the United States. So that's on the adult side. On the minor side, largely across the United States, minors are governed by the rules of that individual state. And so the regulatory compliance for a juvenile facility is going to vary from state to state. That doesn't give us much opportunity to compare a shelter program for juveniles in Texas versus a shelter program for juveniles in Michigan, because their regulatory requirements are different. So that hinders us in a way of being able to say, are we getting the kind of output out of these services that we need? For some states, the regulatory landscape is so arduous, it's so difficult that we're disincented to serve minors because it's going to take 3 years to get your compliance together, or you're going to have to pay very high salaries and you're going to be required to have particular positions on staff. And that may exclude some wonderful and committed people from engaging in shelter care for minors. So on both sides of the equation, we're kind of in a difficult space, but the good news is this is largely being governed by people who are driven by their heart, not people who are driven by other motives. I don't know what to say with that. You'll think of something. This is a landscape that is largely driven by people who are governed by their heart. Right now in the United States, 67% of the shelter programs are run by faith-based organizations. And so they're not in it for the money. They're not in it for the compliance. They're in it to see the best in the lives of survivors.
Great.
You can chop that other piece out.
Great.
I love seeing that smile.
Those
Good.
are all your questions, right?
Yep.
All right. I have a question for you,
Yeah.
particular to the challenge in training staff.
Yeah.
And if you lose a staff member, that investment, you don't just replace that person tomorrow. This is like losing a Navy SEAL. There's $2 million invested in this guy.
Yeah.
So just whatever you want to say in that landscape of the burnout rate, but particularly to so many people go, I want to volunteer, I want to help the survivor, right?
Yeah.
It's like this is a level of trauma that people think they can handle, but they can't. So the investment that goes into training staff.
Okay. You might be surprised to know that the greatest challenge that shelter agencies face, and this has rung true for the last 5 years, is staffing. Yes, the service population is difficult. Yes, spending every day with people who've incurred this kind of trauma and abuse is very taxing. But that pales in comparison to how challenging it is to find the people of the right disposition and right motive to do this work. Some people are so drawn by their heart that they aren't bringing their head with them in this work. And we pour in a lot to prepare somebody to deal with the spiritual warfare that we deal with in this work, the emotional taxation that comes with listening to trauma stories day in and day out, the impact that this will have on your family. And so there's a tremendous investment that goes into preparing staff to be able to walk alongside survivors well, and to do that in a way that creates a healthy relationship. You know, Dr. Judy Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, said recently that a true caregiver who is going to work with a traumatized population, they need to be indifferent and neutral. And those are not the characteristics generally we use in the job descriptions. But what she means by indifferent and neutral is, by being indifferent, it means you're not expecting that person to meet your needs. And by being neutral, you're not directing the outcome of that survivor's life. And those two disciplines are very, very challenging for us. We have to, as that great old song from the 80s says, hold on loosely, but don't let go, because if you cling too tightly, you're going to lose control. We need to hold loosely in care for survivors, but we also need to be loose enough that when they're ready to fly, we can let them go.
Amazing, amazing. Jeanne, what I would call the triage section of this fight, dealing with the survivor once the trauma has happened, in your opinion, what would you potentially, just dreaming, like to see happen on the front end, on stemming the tide, demand, but also, you know, educating the population on how to safeguard against predators? Just free thought. I know that's not the work you do,
Yeah.
but you could wish a little bit about, man, it would be cool if.
Being on the restorative care side, we do get a lens on imagining what prevention might look like. And we get that imagination from the survivors themselves. I can't sit here and know for a fact that 97% of the women and girls that I've done life with were abused as children, and not say if that's 97% of their shared histories, then that's where we need to be in terms of, if not prevention, early intervention. It hurts me to know that the most common lament I get from prosecutors and law enforcement professionals when they're dealing with juveniles is that a juvenile's testimony isn't believed in court, or that children are too often discredited, or a mandated reporter says, oh, the kid's making it up. If we're not going to believe a child who has to go through extraordinary courage and risk to disclose, then we should expect to see the numbers of victims coming into restorative care 15, 20 years later.
Yeah. Jeanne, is this a violent crime at times? And does it always have to be violent in order for a predator or a pimp to have their way?
When I first got into this work, I was latched on to the definition of force, fraud, and coercion, and frankly, had seen enough of the Hollywood movies that suggested that somebody's going to be snatched out of a parking lot and tied to a radiator and all of this sort of drama that sells film, and that's fine. But I've never heard that in the true narratives of survivors. What I've heard time and time again is that the real violence that they have suffered is relational. The real violence that they still today are wounded by is the violence of betrayal. It's the violence of abandonment. It's the violence of you were supposed to love me and you didn't. It's the violence of, but you're my mom. So when we attend to the wounded, we are attending to people who have incurred horrific violence, but it's not physical. It's relational and it's spiritual. And that's why we know and why we ascribe to what the psychological literature says about complex trauma, is that it can only be healed in relationship because the wound was created outside of relationship.
That's it for me, man.
Yeah, we got what we
Okay.
were looking for.
Sit right there, we're getting a picture.
Okay.